Thank you very much, Dr. Amran. Very interesting ideas and suggestions you made that about this Salafi movement. But I'll leave it to question and answers. But just want to mention a little bit about when you try to correlate between Abduh and Afghani to the Salafi movement. I have to say that it's true that the movement of Muhammad Abduh and Afghani was basically a Salafiyah movement, right? But as we had written in our book when we translated and published 2 books on Muhammad Abduh about the contribution of Muhammad Abduh, Imam Muhammad Abduh to science and technology, and also on the Manhaj Islah al-Imam Muhammad Abduh by another scholar. We basically said that we have to differentiate between the 2 types of Salafiyah. The current Salafiyah of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahab and the current Salafiyah in the Malay world now, basically they are what we call, or to use the terminology by Tariq Ramadan, as Salafiyah Harfiyah, meaning to say they are the literalists. The literalist Salafi means that they look at what I mentioned just now about being a literalist. Whereas the Muhammad Abduh and Afghani, they were what we wrote in our book as Salafiyah Aqliyah, means that they use the rational faculty, even though it's based on text, but they use the rational faculty to decide or to interpret context, the text and context. Yeah, so that's a nuance. We have to understand this nuance between the 2, and with that we can proceed forward. I do not want to take much more time, but I would like to invite Professor Syed Farid Alatas. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So thank you to Dr. Farouk. I always enjoy the invitations to speak at IRF forums. Let me just begin with a remark about the issue of causality. Yeah, I think the basic point of Dr. Farouk is that this doctrine of Islamic occasionalism is unscientific and would be detrimental to science, to the idea of science, because it denies causality. And Dr. Amran is claiming otherwise. And I think Dr. Amran has a point, because it has been argued that Islamic occasionalism actually is close to what is understood in quantum physics regarding the whole issue of causality. And also in the Western tradition, somebody similar to al-Ghazali is David Hume. David Hume also spoke against the idea of causality, but did not deny the possibility of science. So I think my point is just that this is the kind of discussion that we need to have more in Malaysia. And in fact, if the position is that al-Ghazalian doctrine or Ash'ari doctrine regarding causality was not the cause of the decline of science, then we have to look into other reasons for the decline of science in Muslim civilization. And there is a lively debate outside of Malaysia. There is a lively debate about that. Some people have said that the cause for the decline of science is not related to Islamic doctrines as such, but rather to structural problems, political problems and structural problems relating to economy and the institutions like universities and so on. But this is a very important issue for us to get into. And I think maybe we could even organize something along those lines in the future. Now, okay, what is wrong with Islam? I must begin with a claim that Dr. Farouk was very mischievous in selecting this, in wording the topic in this manner. Of course, Dr. Farouk does not mean that he's not implying that there is something wrong with Islam. Obviously, there is something wrong with Muslims, right? And when we say Islam here, we don't mean Islam as the religion revealed, or Islam as it exists in the mind of God, as it were. And I'm using, of course, mind in a metaphorical sense. But once Islam is accepted, understood, and interpreted by human beings, that is where the problems start. So when we talk about Islam as a way of life, we're not talking about the revelation, we're talking about Islam as understood and practiced by Muslims. For example, tariqah, a Sufi tariqah, is not Islam as a revelation, but it is Islam as understood and practiced by human beings. Or certain schools of thought, certain aqidah, formulations of the aqidah, the credo of Islam, or certain jurisprudential theories. All this is Islam, but Islam as practiced and understood and theorized by human beings. And those things can go wrong. So that is what obviously is meant by this question, what is wrong with Islam today? In other words, what is wrong with Muslims? And I agree with the speakers, with Dr. Farouk and the other speakers, that there is the problem of literalism, there is a problem of certain schools of thought like Salafism, and one of the problems of Salafism is that it is a literalist orientation among Muslims. But I want to look at a different problem. I want to look at the problem of authoritarianism. And this is something wrong with Muslims. And I'm speaking particularly about the situation in Malaysia. And so I want to talk more about the situation in Malaysia. Now, what Dr. Farouk says about the problem of decline of science and the various issues that he raised here as well as in other forums. These are ideas that are discussed widely among scholars in the Muslim world. But there is no lively discussion on these issues, such as the discussions we're having today in Malaysia. Why is that? It's one of the reasons is that, you see, if we take the Malay world, we take Malaysia and Indonesia. Of course, in pre-colonial times, there's no Malaysia and Indonesia. You have various polities, various dynasties comprising what we call the Malay world. Now, the part of the Malay world that we today call the Malay Peninsula, Semenanjung Melayu, this part of the Malay world had never been an intellectual center, right? In other words, for centuries, this part of the Malay world that we call the Malay Peninsula was an intellectual backwater. There are no major works in theology and philosophy, in Islamic theology and philosophy, and for that matter, even the so-called Hindu-Buddhist, scholarship in pre-Islamic past. There are no major works coming from this part of the Malay world. So this is part of the problem. Now, we have inherited this lack of intellectual culture. Now, you just look across, seberang. If you just look across what is seberang? No. Seberang, to Indonesia. You look across the straits of Malacca, and you look across the Java Sea. You go to Sumatra, to Java. In the past, they were lively centers of scholarship and discourse. Today, you find great diversity in Indonesia. You have Salafis, you have Shiites, you have Mu'tazilites, you have Asharis, you have the whole spectrum of orientations and ideologies. Both those that are inherited from the past, from the pre-colonial past, as well as those that were influenced by colonialism, and those that are influenced by modernist Islamic movements, as well as Western schools of thought. We don't have that in Malaysia. There's a very big difference between the intellectual culture in Malaysia and in Indonesia. So what I would say is, what is wrong with Muslims in Malaysia today is that we have an authoritarian and narrow intellectual culture. as I said, the kind of discussions and even debates that we might start having here, for example, I agree with Dr. Farouk on almost everything, but except this issue of Islamic occasionalism. Because I don't seem to think that Islamic occasionalism actually is detrimental to scientific activity. But that's another matter, right? But it is very good to have these kinds of discussions. But what you get in Malaysia instead are stupid polemics, right? Even the whole thing about Shiism. I defend the idea that Shiism is deviant, right? Although I'm not Shiite myself. I'm accused of being Shiite because I make that defense. Although I do find problems with Shiism, but not to the extent that they should be out of the fold of Islam and they should be banned. I find more problems with Wahhabism, but I do not agree that Wahhabism should be banned, right? The point is we should be having discourse and debate and discussion about matters relating to Shiite theology, about matters relating to Salafi ideas. We should have discussions. This is what happens in Indonesia, and this is what happens in other parts of the Muslim world. But we are, we are becoming more and more authoritarian in our mentality and also in our politics in Malaysia. And this is something that has to be resisted, especially by the Malays, because what the Malays on the ground think is what determines the political outcomes in this country. Now, so I want to talk about authoritarianism. Now, the issue of authoritarianism is rooted in the pre-colonial and colonial periods, and specifically in the Orientalist understanding of Malay identity. So that's what I want to discuss. Now, very briefly, let me say that Orientalism, as it emerged in the late colonial period, by the 19th century, there are a number of features of Orientalism. I'm not going to go into the details. Orientalism marginalizes the local ideas, local concepts. For example, until today, when we teach Malay studies in Malaysian universities, we mainly present a European understanding of Malay identity and Malay culture and even Malay history. For example, the fact that it was one of the first critiques of colonialism and colonial ideology and even colonial categories, colonial interpretations or European interpretations of the local. One of the first was from the pen of Jose Rizal, late 19th century thinker and reformer from the Philippines. That idea is almost unknown in Malaysia, because when we talk, when we teach, and when we do research, our research agenda comes from Malay studies as it started in Britain and in the Netherlands, and we continue that tradition. So the local is marginalized. There's also a distortion in Orientalism of local realities. The classic example, and I always like to give this example, we are told in Malaysia, in Malay studies, that prior to the coming of Islam, the religion of the people were, or was, what was it? Hinduism. And they have this strange category, Hindu/Buddhism, Hindu, Buddhist. This is nonsense, because in pre-colonial times there wasn't such a thing as the religion of Hinduism. Hinduism is a colonial, is an Orientalist construction. If you go back to India in the 15th century, no one would call themselves a Hindu. What we call Hinduism is actually various religions, and the people that we are calling Hindus consider themselves as belonging to different religious traditions. But when the Europeans, encountered India, they thought it was one religion, and each community, the community that worshipped Vishnu, a community that worshipped Shiva and Brahma, and so on and so forth. These are all denominations within one religion. And the Europeans gave the name Hinduism to that religion that they created in their minds. So here you have a distortion. And then when the Dutch came to Indonesia, they saw what looked is a feudalistic tradition in Malay culture and history, a more rational egalitarian tradition. But it is the feudal tradition that was stressed by the British. For example, in the Sejarah Melayu, you have a lot of emphasis on the feudalistic elements of Malay culture. But in another work, there you have a stress on the more egalitarian aspects of Malay culture. So, for example, the idea that the ruler, the sultan, must be himself under the law. There's certain ideas of, and many ideas of equality in the Tajus Salatin. But the egalitarian elements and the more rational elements in Malay culture, in Malay literature, were underplayed, and the feudalistic elements were stressed. And that was taken, internalized by the Malays themselves, particularly by the Malay elites. And in the post-colonial period, we inherited that understanding of Malay culture and Malay identity. So the feudal element, of the feudal tradition in Malay culture, which stresses it's a top-down approach, it's authoritarian, it stresses the irrational and magical elements, it puts the rulers above the law, and it basically has a derogatory outlook on the Malays, that the Malays are a poor lot who will be nowhere without the rulers. The idea of the basic incapacity, the incapacity of the Malay rakyat who will be nowhere without the rulers. So you see, this feudalistic idea is in line, of course, with the interests of the rulers who require the Malays in their mentality to be dependent on the rulers. And this feudalistic idea was stressed by the Europeans because it was in their interest to promote the view that the Malays, as well as other natives in our region, the Javanese and the Filipinos, it is in their interest to stress the idea that the Malays are basically a people who have low capacities, the idea of Malay laziness, for example, to justify colonialism and to justify colonial capitalism. And this idea was internalized by the Malay elite who took over the rule of Malaya and then Malaysia. Because it is also in their ideas, in their interest to promote that idea, because they want all of you Malays, all of us, to vote for them into power forever, because without them, we will hilang daripada dunia. That's the whole idea, right? Without the elite. So the same authoritarian ideals that the people do not know much. It is the rulers who know, and the rulers will decide what is Islam, how is Islam to be defined, what kind of Islam to practice. You cannot leave it up to the people. This is the kind of feudalistic authoritarian mentality that we have inherited from pre-colonial times, strengthened by colonial scholarship in the area of Malay studies, and then internalized by the Malay elite, and now it is a basis of the ideology of the ruling class. And the feudalistic authoritarian mentality translates into an authoritarian interpretation of Islam. So much so that we believe, many lay people believe, that Islam is authoritarian in orientation, and that democracy is a Western, a Western idea and a secular idea, and it should be rejected. Not, if you look at the scholarship though in Islamic jurisprudence, we will find that silencing and censorship, even banning of books, banning of ideas, banning of groups, is something that is not recognized in Islamic law. It is simply not recognized in Islamic law unless a group or an individual is guilty of certain crimes, like sedition, like insult, like libel, right? These are all terms that exist in Islamic jurisprudence. But in the West, in the Western legal system, it is the same thing. You have freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but if you say something about someone which is libelous or seditious, you can be taken to court, right? But if you express your opinion and you have a dissenting view, ikhtilaf is dissent. Even if you have ikhtilaf concerning a view that is, you take a minority view and you are against the majority view, you might be wrong. But Islamic law doesn't allow you to be punished for that. And this is our tradition, but these are not the aspects of Islamic law, these are not the aspects of Islamic tradition that you are told by the ulama. Because it's not in their interest to tell you these things. Also, the freedom that Islam gives, and when I say Islam, I mean Islamic law. The freedom that Islamic law gives to express opinions, Rai, R-A'-Y, opinion. The freedom that Islamic law gives to express opinions, even if those opinions are deemed to be blameworthy, yeah? Even if those opinions are deemed to be blameworthy, in the sense of being, for example, bid'ah. You express an opinion which is bid'ah, and therefore, let's say held by the majority as bid'ah, wrongful innovation, therefore it is blameworthy. Or, as I said, you disagree, ikhtilaf, with the majority view, and you are regarded as being wrong. They are not punishable by prohibition. Rather, they should be dealt with by the community or by the scholars through, through nasiha, through advice, through moral suasion and so on and so forth, but not punishment by banning and restriction and so on. So this is part of our tradition, but it's not the part of our tradition, Malay Islamic tradition, which has been handed down from generation to generation since the pre-colonial period, and then become part of our political and intellectual culture today. So what we have instead is a very monolithic understanding of Islam, basically the Islam of the elite, which is a continuity from the Islam of the feudal elite in the past, in the pre-colonial and colonial period. It is an Islam which is authoritarian, which tends to define reality and to draw on texts and draw on doctrines that are in line with its own interests. So if drawing upon Salafism or supporting Salafism, such as giving permanent residence to Zakir Naik, is in line with their interests, they will do so. And that is the reason why we are having this problem of rising Salafism in Malaysia. Not because our elite actually believe in Salafi doctrine. I'm sure most of them do not believe in Salafi doctrine. Among the ulama, there would be many who do. But then, the so-called secular politicians, I mean the lay politicians, they do not believe in Salafism. But it is in their interest to support it, or at least to be silent about its growth in Malaysia. And we have, along with that, along with this feudal mentality, an exclusivism. An exclusivism which was not present in the past, in the Malay world. Islam in the Malay world tend to be more sophistic and more egalitarian and more heterogeneous. Now Islam is defined in terms of Shafi'i school. Even because of Salafi influence, even Sufism is under threat. And non-Sunni groups are also under threat. And Malaysia has distinguished itself as being one of the very few Muslim countries that actually persecutes Shiites. And I do not discount the possibility of persecution of Sufis in the future. But certainly there is persecution of Shiites. But this is a country of, as we say, Bole land is a country of contradictions. Are you familiar with, what is the most well-known English translation of the Quran? See, everybody says Abdullah Yusuf Ali, right? And if I think a few years ago, a reissue of the translation was published in Malaysia and launched by the Prime Minister. Several, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. But Yusuf Ali was a Shia, and the worst kind. I mean, not even the majority Shia, you know, the Ithna Ashari, the 12 Shias, he was a Bohra. Yeah, even worse than the 12 Shiites. But we launched the book, and we're also putting, persecuting members of the Shiite. Yeah. And we, we don't take our own action seriously. Malaysia is signatory to the Amman message. The Amman message, was a declaration signed by hundreds of Muslim scholars and political leaders from around the world, Sunnis as well as Shiites, declaring several schools of thought and sects in Islam as valid, including 12 Shiism and Zaidi Shiism. Malaysia signed this when Dato Abdullah Badawi was Prime Minister, but we have neglected it. We have gone against it in terms of what we are doing. So there is clearly something seriously wrong with Islam as it is understood by the elite, right? And as is propagated in Malaysia today. There are only two groups that can save Muslims in Malaysia. There are only two groups. And I'll end by making reference to these two groups. The first group are the rulers, the Malay rulers. Of course, I understand many people would be skeptical about the likelihood of the Malay rulers to save Islam in Malaysia. I myself am uncertain. I say that they are a group that can save Islam because they at least have the ability to do so and the constitutional backing to do so, because they are the authorities of Islam in Malaysia. They are the ones who have the authority behind the muftis and the religious councils in the various states. They are the ones who allow a fatwa to become law in a particular state. So they have the ability to do so if they want to do so. And we have at least seen some positive signs. They came out in support. Dr. Chandra, we were at the G25 forum yesterday, was talking about how some of the rulers had supported, or the Council of Rulers had supported the initiative to revive the Rukun Negara, which is a democratic instrument in Malaysia. And we have seen some of the sultans come out in making very favorable statements. Sultan of Johor has done so. The ruler of Negeri Sembilan, and so on. Sultan of Perak. So there's some possibility. But how far the rulers will go in terms of taking more radical measures, such as making sure you have the right people as muftis, not muftis who make silly statements and come out with opinions that are sometimes just downright ridiculous, and such, and not allowing for the gazetting of laws which are authoritarian and narrow in orientation and which foster exclusivism. How far rulers will go in doing this really depends on the Rakyat, especially the Malays. And that is the second group that can save Malaysia. It is you, it is us. And we have not used our potential to do so. Why, how is it, the case of Amri Ahmad? Yeah. Let's forget about whether he's a Sunni or a Shiite. I mean, they say he's a Shiite, right? And probably he is. But let's forget about that. The man is missing. He has, in all likelihood, been abducted. Whatever it is, he's missing for more than 1 year. His family, his wife are in distress. They are miserable. Can you understand that? How can a mufti say, oh, maybe he's gone to Thailand for mut'ah, you know? Or maybe he's gone off to Iran. That is just plain nastiness. But these are the kinds of leaders we have. How can we have a mufti who says that, referring to the DAP, I think that they are kafir harbi, right? Infidels with whom we Muslims can go to war, against whom Muslims can go to war. How can we have... it's our fault. Don't blame the sultans. It's our fault. Because we as Muslims, as the masses, do not express outrage at such religious leadership. We do not express outrage. What do we express outrage at? When there is a rumor going around that there is pork in Tabasco or in Cadbury chocolate, then the social media is flooded. And people are angry, people are even crying, oh my God, I ate Cadbury chocolate, and maybe there was pork in it. So we express outrage at those things, and then the authorities do something. But the real important things, when people's lives are at stake, people's livelihood are at stake, people's happiness, we don't express outrage. And the result is we get leaders like this. I always say that if Sunni Muslims in Malaysia, if we stand up and we say, you know, with one voice, that we do not agree with the persecution of our Shiite brothers, the government will become the biggest defenders of Shiites, and they will defend the Amman message. Because at the end of the day, it's all about votes for the government. So we have the power, people have the power, but we are not using it. So it's high time, I think, at least at the intellectual level, as Muslims, we should rediscover the egalitarian democratic tradition in our heritage, in Malay culture, Malay literature, rediscover that, and claim egalitarianism and democracy and rationalism as not simply Western. They are Western, but they also have roots in Malay tradition. Let's reclaim that, right? And make that our dominant intellectual and political culture. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.